Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading that day. This week our reading is centered around the book of Revelation. Today I'm joined by Sheryl Daughety and Alyssa Bream, and we're going to look at a question from Revelation chapter 11. And it says, "Then I was given a measuring stick, and I was told, 'Go and measure the temple of God and the altar and count the number of worshipers. But do not measure the outer courtyard, for it has been turned over to the nations. They will trample the holy city for 42 months, and I will give power to my two witnesses. They will be clothed in burlap and will prophesy during these 1260 days. These two prophets are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of all the earth. If anyone tries to harm them, fire flashes from their mouths and consumes their enemies. This is how anyone who tries to harm them must die. They have power to shut the sky so that no rain will fall for as long as they prophesy. And they have the power to turn the rivers and oceans into blood and strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they wish." It goes on to talk about this is an intriguing piece, and in full disclosure, we're speculating. We may have some educated guesses, but
if we had the answers, we'd be rich.
Yeah. Well, there are some people who have gotten rich saying they had the answers.
Yep.
So I really think there are only three options myself.
Only three?
Yeah, I really think there are only three options.
Give us those options, Stephen.
Okay. So
I'll tell you which one we think is right.
I think it could be Moses and Elijah. And I would say that's probably the most common thought. I don't think it has always been my thought, and I'll give you the second option in just a minute. But I think, and there are a couple of things that point to that possibility. One, they are the two that appeared at the transfiguration of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Two, it specifically talks about fire flashing down and killing people, and then having the power to turn the rivers into blood and bring plagues. The fire flashing down and killing the people is a reference to Elijah on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal. The turning the river into blood is a kind of an allusion to Moses and the plagues. So those would be two possibilities. The other two possibilities, and you'd have to read on further here to understand, but the other two possibilities are, one is still Elijah, and the other is Enoch. And that's probably early in my life what I would have thought would have been the two, was Elijah.
It must have been a good Pentecostal way to believe it.
Yeah, Elijah and Enoch, because they didn't die. They're both taken away by the Lord. Enoch walked with God and was not. That's what it says. And God took him away. Elijah's taken away in a chariot of fire. The third option is that it is two random believers that are alive at that time that God raises up to use. That's the third option, I think. I think it's probably the least predictable, but I think during that time. So what are y'all's theories? Which one of those do you, which one am I right? Which one is right?
I pick option A.
Hey, you think option A is it?
I mean, it seems to me like more of the context clues point to them.
Right. I would agree.
So I'll say this before I give my opinion. Apparently some Jewish traditions say that Moses didn't die, and so that would make sense in this context if it was, because Elijah and Moses make more sense. The only reason Enoch is even thought of is because he didn't die in Scripture.
Because we don't have much information about his spirituality or leadership.
Right. And this is where all of this interpretation stuff gets real dicey. I'm probably always going to view Revelation as more symbolic than probably either of you guys. And so if you look at Elijah and Moses, which I think that's kind of is what is being alluded to here. I don't think
so.
Too many people would disagree with that, but I think that it stands for the law and the prophets. And then
they represent them.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. And so I think because even as I was looking at this, because what other smarter people than me that have studied and done all that, people said that there was maybe even thoughts that like Peter and Paul could be it because both of them were executed around the same time, around when this book would have been written. And then the number 2 is important because you always had to have 2 witnesses for anything. Right. You had to have people were sent out in pairs to spread the gospel. And so in some ways, this to me seems like just a representation of the church. They're also called lampstands. These 2 prophets are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands,
which is a reference back to Zechariah. That is a verse in Zechariah.
Yeah, but lampstands in Revelation tend to stand for churches, right? I think so. Like, I think I'm not reading this as these 2 people are going to come. I think it's more of the law and the prophets, and there's going to be witnesses that perform this. I don't necessarily think that
just 2. You don't think it's just 2?
I feel like there's so many things that are symbolic and representative of so many things in Revelation that these 2 particular people may be the faces for that representation. But I agree with Alyssa that it seems like it has a lot to do with the prophets in general too, and the law, because, when they talk about the time that goes by and how many people are going to come by and just have parties basically about the fact, oh, great, they're finally dead. Because it's something that is talked about a lot with the prophets that, people just scoff at them and you're really getting on our nerves. We don't want to hear what you have to say anymore. And they'd be excited if something bad were to happen and they didn't have to be confronted with their sin any longer.
Yeah, well, the 2 witnesses is an Old Testament concept. There had to be 2 witnesses to confirm anything. You could, as a matter of fact, if you even looked at things like murder, you couldn't convict somebody unless you had 2 or more witnesses. They had to be able to see it, not just a single witness. And the book of Revelation is the culmination of everything. It's the culmination of everything we've read. It is the fulfillment fully of the law and everything the prophets said were coming. It's all of that. Whether it is 2 individual people or multiple people, I do think it could be random people. I think that's possible. I think God could raise up 2 random people or 2 random groups of people. I don't know. And in full disclosure, it's one of the reasons I dislike the book of Revelation. No, it's all of the. So, like when Paul says, "Don't commit adultery," that's straightforward. Like I like that.
Not really.
It is straight. It's straightforward.
Not really, because I think it has to do with a whole lot more than just what we associate with adultery.
Jesus said, "If you look on a woman with lust in your heart, you've committed adultery."
Right.
Yeah.
But I also think that
that's
adultery,
relatively straightforward.
Yeah, but I also think that adultery refers to our sin in general, because we're being unfaithful to God, making idols.
In places in the Old Testament, I don't think that's what he's referring to in the New Testament.
We'll talk about it later.
Well, when he says adultery, drunkenness, lying, backbiting, when he gives those lists, like he's not. I don't think that's what he's saying.
I don't think every time it's referred to.
Oh, no.
That's specifically
in the Old Testament. Adultery was the abandonment of your relationship with God. Yeah. Almost always. It wasn't. It was rarely. It wasn't always. In the New Testament, though, the overwhelming majority of times that word is used as speaking specifically of marital unfaithfulness. I think it's much more straightforward than beasts with 10 heads and creatures with horns and feet of brass or feet of clay and legs of brass or whatever, I think that is why people avoid this book in particular, is because there are so many possibilities. They want clarity. And in leadership, the one thing they will tell you is clarity is king. When there is not clarity, you will struggle. Now, I'm not saying we don't need the book, but when you have clarity, it helps everybody. And this book, it brings clarity to some things, but the one thing it clarifies for me is what's going to happen at the end is way beyond my ability to comprehend, and I'm just going to have to wait and enjoy it when it happens.
The canonization process of Revelation is really interesting. It was actually the last book to be added to the canon, and there was a lot of disagreement about it because the very early Christians who would have been like receiving the original letter and reading it, they loved it because it was very obvious that Babylon in Revelation stood for Rome, and that it was, things were going to be made right, and they loved that, and that's what they understood, that God was in control, in ultimate control, and that was reassuring to them. Then you go forward a few hundred years, and all of a sudden Rome and Christianity are synonymous.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a big fight to get Revelation into the Bible. And it was about 400 years, about 390 something, that it was added to the canon.
Yeah, we didn't have our full canon of scripture until the 300s.
Right.
Sometime.
And this was the last one that they could agree on.
Hebrews was another book that wasn't in many of the early, is it canonical? I don't know what the word is. Compilations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be sad?
Well, yeah. I would guess that a lot of the reason on the book of Hebrews is the lack of ability to know who to attribute it to. Almost everything else in the New Testament, we can say this person wrote it.
I'm going to believe it was Priscilla.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I didn't read that anywhere.
That's okay.
But it could have been 1,000 people. It really could have been 1,000 people. What do you think the purpose of those two witnesses are?
We kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, in that it represents prophets. I think it can also represent just believers in general, in the way that we have often felt the rest of the world sees us and would love to kick us when we're down and celebrate that they think we're crazy for what we believe, and then they don't want to hear it. They don't want to talk about sin.
But in this, like the couple of verses I read, they have the ability to destroy their enemies. What's the purpose of that in that moment? Because eventually the tide turns.
I mean, do you not think that points back to Christ?
You mean their ability to destroy? I think it is kind of symbolism of. I want to make sure I word
the time that goes by
correctly. Because the whole 42 months thing, 7 years of tribulation, half. Because this. Well, Jay and I get into this a little bit. The whole pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib kind of conversation. This here is one of the passages that people who believe in some type of mid-trib rapture would use, that Christ is present. They're working. These witnesses are working halfway through the tribulation, and then they're going to be taken out. It's at that moment that we're taken away, not before all of this starts. We're here in the watching all of this happen. That's above my pay grade. I didn't get called to determine that. But the way, when I read that about the witnesses, and if, no matter who it is, I see them carrying out something I think they wish they could have done. Let's say it's Elijah and Moses, that they could have done while they were here, like just breathe fire on whoever they wanted to, right? Like,
They didn't brush their teeth that morning.
Think about what a great gift that would be sometimes, but it also points.
No, it would not be.
What, to not brush your teeth or to be able to breathe fire on somebody?
Should breathe fire on people. But I think that's why I feel like that is pointing back to Christ, because he did have the ability to do those things, and he didn't.
But it's coming to pass here.
Right.
People are being judged. This becomes kind of the beginning of the judgment that takes place.
I think this story, as it goes on, death cannot silence God's truth. Even though these witnesses die, God's truth prevails. And a reminder to be ready that we have to pay any cost to be a Christian, but that there will be final vindication.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are from the first part is a little more dicey, but after you watch them get killed in the street, and like I think that's the part that I draw the lessons from more than that first part, because fire breathing is something that happens in Dungeons and Dragons, not.
You think about, if it's the law and the prophets, you think about all of the times, particularly prophets, if they had had that ability, like they were telling that it was going to happen, but prophets were persecuted. None of them were, most of them weren't lauded. They didn't have a place of popularity. They weren't popular people, but I do think it points to the separation that we begin to see between the whole godliness and ungodliness, holiness and unrighteousness. That's kind of what we begin to see this taking place. So, well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Revelation.